The winds that sweep across the fields of Edgehill carry with them a bitter chill, a reminder of the blood that once soaked this land. Even centuries after England's brutal civil conflict tore through these grounds, locals claim the battle itself never truly ended. They say, as night falls and mist rises, ghostly figures in armor replay their last desperate charge, locked in a spectral battle for eternity. Edgehill, the site of England's first major clash in the Civil War, has become as much a graveyard of souls as it is a page in history. But what remains hidden here are not only the bodies buried beneath, but the souls that refuse to rest. Nestled in the heart of Warwickshire, the land appears serene by day, with green hills rolling under a wide sky, but as night descends, Edgehill becomes a different world entirely. When the moonlight barely breaks through thick clouds, and the only sound is the whistle of the wind, the battlefield comes to life in a way that horrifies those who dare witness it. It is said that the spirits of those who perished on October 23, 1642, during the war between King Charles I and the parliamentarians, continue to haunt these grounds, fighting, screaming, and dying over and over in an endless loop. 4 stories circulate among the people here, each chilling in its own right. These tales, passed down through generations, speak of terrifying apparitions, ghastly sounds, and shadowy figures that defy all logic. Let us delve into these tales, the very fabric of Edgehill's haunted legacy. Somewhere in the stillness of the English countryside, under a sky blanketed with mist, Samuel Hayworth shivered, clutching his lantern tightly as he stood on his nightly watch. He was a young man, tall and sturdy, with dark hair that curled slightly beneath his worn cap, a village watchman from Kinnerton who had been charged with patrolling the edge of Edgehill. It was the kind of job he had taken out of necessity rather than desire, but he felt the weight of duty keenly. This duty, though, would come to haunt him in ways he could never have foreseen. That night, the air was strangely still, the usual sounds of owls and distant sheep absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that clung to him like a second skin. The world felt close, as though waiting for something unseen to happen. Samuel thought of the stories that had circulated in the town recently, the whispers of strange sights on Edgehill, eerie lights, and spectral sounds that defied explanation. Even the innkeeper, a stout, sensible man, had warned him the night before, saying, "Mind your eyes on that field, boy. The souls of men don't leave easy from Edgehill." Yet, as practical as he was, Samuel had dismissed these tales as superstition. He had heard such stories before, passed down from mothers to sons, each embellished with the same haunted look in the eyes, meant to frighten young children into obedience. A few ghostly tales, after all, were nothing against the kind of fear Samuel knew he should have, the fear of deserters, of thieves, of those who wandered the countryside in desperation, looking to take what little he owned. But tonight, as he gazed over the mist-draped hills of Edgehill, Samuel felt something was different. He couldn't put his finger on it. Perhaps it was the way the fog crept low along the ground, almost alive, or how his skin prickled as though he were being watched. Somewhere out there, under the ghostly cover of fog, the land remembered death, a bloody and violent history that could not be forgotten. Edgehill. The name itself was carved into history as the site of the first major battle of the English Civil War, where the forces of King Charles I had clashed with the parliamentarians in a brutal struggle that left thousands dead. For hours, the two sides had fought under the cold October sky, neither able to claim victory, each leaving the other bloodied and broken. It was a landscape that had drunk deeply of death, where cries of pain and rage had filled the air long after the soldiers' hearts had stilled. Those sounds, Samuel thought, were perhaps still echoing, their fury trapped in the valley. Samuel tried to shake off the unsettling feeling, his rational mind pushing back against the superstitions that had wrapped themselves around his thoughts. He shifted his grip on his lantern, glancing down the dirt road he was meant to watch. Yet, despite his efforts to focus on his duty, his gaze kept drifting back to the hillside. It was then he saw it, a faint light flickering in the distance. His heart leapt to his throat, and he squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It was so small at first that he thought it must be a reflection, perhaps a trick of the mist and moonlight, but it grew steadily, taking shape against the murky darkness of the hill. The light moved, bobbing up and down, as though held by someone walking. Samuel's first thought was that it might be a traveler, or perhaps another watchman, but the light was too pale, too cold. He squinted harder, stepping closer to the edge of the road, straining his eyes to see. And then he saw them. More lights, tiny glimmers that sprang up like fireflies across the field, illuminating faint figures in armor, carrying weapons that gleamed with an otherworldly sheen. A shiver ran down his spine, and he swallowed hard, suddenly gripped by the overwhelming urge to look away. Yet his eyes stayed glued to the sight, fascinated and horrified in equal measure. These figures, no, these soldiers, seemed to move as one, as though guided by an unseen commander, lining up in ranks that stretched across the field. Samuel recognized the movements, the steady discipline of an army preparing for battle, and a sick realization settled over him. These were not ordinary men. These were the ghosts of soldiers, spectral forms replaying a scene long past. He watched in horrified silence as the phantoms assembled, their faces hidden beneath helmets and shadows, yet each seeming to carry a weight of sorrow, of anger. There was no sound, no clank of armor or clatter of weapons, only the eerie silence that stretched out over the field, thickening the air around him. Before Samuel could make sense of the sight, the scene shifted. The soldiers on the hill drew their weapons, raising them in unison, their figures sharp and cold in the faint light. He could see swords, muskets, pikes, all held with a deadly precision that made his heart hammer wildly in his chest. Then, without warning, a deafening noise shattered the silence. The ground beneath him seemed to tremble as an explosion of sound filled the air, cannons firing, muskets discharging in rapid succession, screams and shouts echoing through the mist. Samuel stumbled backward, clutching at his chest as the noise surrounded him. Every shout and roar tearing into his ears with a fury that defied explanation. Yet when he looked back, the figures on the hill were still there, frozen in their ghostly charge. But then they began to move. The soldiers surged forward, charging down the hill with a silent ferocity, their faces hidden in shadows as they bore down upon an unseen enemy. Samuel watched, rooted to the spot, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the phantoms swept across the field, each one a dark blur of motion and death. He could see the way their feet moved without disturbing the grass, their swords swinging without cutting air, their bodies half transparent, as though they existed in a world all their own. Yet he could feel them, their rage and their pain, seeping into the very ground he stood upon, filling the air with a sickly chill that clawed at his skin. He could almost hear their thoughts, a desperate determination mingled with a terror that seemed to cling to each figure like a second skin. One ghost, a young man no older than himself, stumbled and fell, clutching his chest as though struck by a bullet. His face twisted in agony, mouth open in a scream that no one could hear, before he crumpled to the ground and faded into mist. Another soldier, an officer by his bearing, raised his sword high, charging forward with an expression of fierce resolve that flickered with sorrow. His eyes locked with Samuel's for a brief, chilling moment, and Samuel's heart lurched, feeling as though he had looked into the face of death itself. Samuel wanted to run, to turn away from the nightmare unfolding before him, but his legs felt as heavy as lead, his feet rooted to the ground as though bound by invisible chains. He could feel his hands shaking, his skin cold and clammy, his mind racing with a primal fear he had never known before. These were not merely phantoms, they were men who had died in agony, their spirits chained to this battlefield, reliving their deaths in an endless cycle of torment. He felt the weight of their suffering, the horror of a life cut short, the terror of a soldier charging into battle knowing that he would likely never see home again. It was a despair so deep, so all-encompassing, that it seemed to seep into Samuel's very bones, filling him with a sadness that went beyond anything he had ever felt. And yet, beneath the sorrow, there was something darker, an anger that pulsed through the air, a rage that had been born in blood and death and had never been allowed to rest. These spirits, these souls, were not at peace. They were trapped, bound to this cursed land by the violence that had ended their lives, by the betrayal of a war that had promised them glory, but had given them only death. As the battle raged on before him, Samuel felt his mind slipping, his sense of self dissolving in the face of the horror he was witnessing. It was as though he were no longer merely a spectator, but a part of the battle itself, his soul pulled into the fray by the sheer force of the spirit's anguish. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the phantoms began to fade, their forms dissolving into the mist like smoke blown away by the wind. The sounds of battle faded, the screams and cannon fire dying into silence, leaving only the gentle rustle of grass and the distant chirp of morning birds. Samuel staggered back, his body weak and trembling, his mind reeling from the nightmare he had just witnessed. He stumbled down the road, barely able to keep himself upright as he made his way back to the village, his mind filled with images of the spectral soldiers, their faces etched into his memory with a clarity that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Days passed, but Samuel could not shake the memory of that night. The faces of the soldiers haunted him, their cries echoing in his mind like a haunting melody that refused to fade. He could still feel the chill of their presence, the weight of their sorrow pressing down upon him, filling his heart with a sadness that seemed to seep into his very soul. He spoke of the vision to no one, unable to put into words the horror he had witnessed. Yet he knew that he would never forget it, that the spirits of Edgehill would remain with him, a reminder of the violence and sorrow that had soaked that land. Years later, on his deathbed, Samuel confided in a local priest, telling him of the Phantom Regiment, of the soldiers doomed to relive their final moments in an endless loop of pain and anger. The priest listened, his face pale and solemn, before giving Samuel a gentle blessing, his words a whisper in the quiet room. Yet the priest, too, could not keep the tale to himself. And so the story of Samuel Hayworth, the watchman who had seen the spirits of Edgehill, passed into legend, a chilling reminder of a battle that would never truly end. Story 2. The Wailing Drummer. In the years following the bloody Battle of Edgehill, tales of strange sounds and ghostly apparitions had spread like wildfire. Edgehill was whispered about in nearby towns, and even hardened soldiers and travellers avoided the area after dark. But for those on the road, sometimes there was no choice. Thomas Lane, a young drummer for the Parliamentarian forces, was one such traveller who found himself at Edgehill under unfortunate circumstances. Just 17, Thomas was wiry and energetic, with a shock of dark hair and a natural curiosity that had gotten him into trouble on more than one occasion. He was no stranger to death or danger, but the rumours of Edgehill's haunted history intrigued him. As he walked along the deserted road toward the nearby village, he scoffed at the stories he'd heard from other soldiers, convinced they were little more than exaggerations or tricks of the mind. When he arrived at a small roadside inn just outside Edgehill, he felt relieved. The sky was darkening quickly, and he had no desire to spend a night sleeping on cold ground, not with autumn's chill already biting the air. He paid the innkeeper a few coins, eager for a warm meal and bed. The innkeeper, a burly, bearded man named Ben, watched him with a wary eye as he took his supper by the fire. "You'll be best keeping indoors tonight," Ben muttered as he refilled Thomas's tankard. His voice was low, his eyes darting toward the window, as if he feared being overheard. Thomas smirked, taking a hearty swig of ale. "You mean the ghost stories, then? A few tales of restless souls isn't enough to frighten me off." Ben didn't smile. "It's more than tales, lad. You'd do well to listen." Thomas's curiosity piqued, but he kept his expression neutral. "I'm not so easily frightened, sir, but tell me, what is it that keeps folks away from Edgehill?" Ben hesitated, his gaze growing distant. "There are many spirits on that field, it's true, but the one they speak of most is the drummer. They say his drumming calls to the dead, rousing them from their rest. He was only a boy, they say. Played his drum right up until..." Ben's voice trailed off, his face pale as he looked away. Thomas chuckled, though unease prickled his skin. "A drummer boy's ghost, then? Well, I'll be sure to keep an ear out." Ben shook his head, his expression grave. "Best you don't, lad. It's not the sort of sound you'll want to hear." Unfazed, Thomas finished his meal and retired to his room. He dismissed Ben's warning as mere superstition, feeling almost foolish for letting it rattle him. But as he lay in bed, his thoughts drifted back to the tales he'd heard on the road. stories of blood-soaked ground and voices calling from the dark. He told himself it was nothing more than nervous imagination, yet sleep did not come easily. Sometime after midnight, as Thomas lay half asleep, a faint sound began to rise from beyond the walls of the inn. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a low, steady thumping. He told himself it was the wind, or perhaps a distant horse's hooves, though something in his gut twisted with unease. But the sound grew louder, a deep and rhythmic beat that echoed through the silence of the night. The rhythm was unmistakable, the slow, deliberate cadence of a drum. He felt his pulse quicken, a cold shiver creeping down his spine as he strained to listen. The drumbeat was growing stronger, its rhythm heavy and mournful, filling the air with a sense of foreboding. It was not the sort of sound he had ever heard from a living drummer, but something darker, more unnatural, as though the drum itself were warning him to turn back. Unable to resist his curiosity, Thomas rose from bed, throwing on his coat and boots. The inn was silent, and he crept out quietly, not wanting to alert Ben or any of the other patrons who might be sleeping. But the moment he stepped outside, the sound grew louder still, a steady beat that pulsed through the night air like a heartbeat. The mist hung thickly over the fields, curling around the trees like pale fingers, and the moon cast an eerie glow over Edgehill. Thomas found himself drawn toward the field, his steps light and cautious as he followed the drum beat, his breath hanging in the air like mist. He moved as if in a trance, compelled by the steady thump-thump-thump of the drum. As he neared the center of the field, he saw him. A lone figure standing in the mist, small and still. It was a boy, no older than Thomas himself, with an expression that seemed to be caught somewhere between sorrow and despair. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his hands moved over the drum with mechanical precision, striking each beat with an emotionless rhythm. The boy's clothing was torn, his coat blood-stained, and his eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to stare at nothing and everything all at once. Thomas felt his heart pound in his chest as he watched, unable to tear his gaze away. The boy played on, his face twisted with a sadness that seemed to reach out and seep into Thomas's very bones. With each beat of the drum, Thomas felt as though he were being pulled deeper into the field, his mind slipping into the same endless despair that haunted the boy's face. It was then he noticed the other figures, the soldiers emerging from the mist, their forms flickering in and out of sight like candle flames. They stood silently, watching the boy, their expressions as hollow and sorrowful as his. They were soldiers from another time, their faces bearing the marks of wounds long healed in death, their eyes empty and haunted. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as he realized they were all watching him. The boy's drumming slowed, each beat growing softer, more deliberate, as though he were drawing out the rhythm of a dirge. Thomas felt his heart sink, a deep and aching sadness filling him as he watched the boy play. The soldiers, too, seemed to feel it, their expressions growing darker, their forms more solid in the moonlight. One by one, they began to approach Thomas, their eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He wanted to run, to scream, but he felt rooted to the spot, his legs as heavy as stone. He could see their faces clearly now, men and boys, some with empty eyes, others with expressions of pain, their hands reaching out as though begging for help. The boy's drumming grew softer still, a low, mournful beat that filled the air with a sense of finality. His hollow gaze met Thomas's, and for a brief moment, Thomas felt as though he were looking into a mirror that reflected his own fear, his own despair. "Why are you here?" Thomas managed to whisper, his voice barely audible over the sound of the drum. The boy's gaze did not waver, his hands still moving over the drum with a slow, steady rhythm. But his eyes seemed to darken, a flicker of something almost human passing through them. And then, with a final resounding beat, the boy stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, an oppressive weight that settled over the field, pressing down on Thomas like a shroud. He felt as though he was standing on the edge of an abyss, staring into the darkness that lay beyond. The boy's mouth opened, and though no words escaped his lips, Thomas felt the force of his silent scream echoing in his mind, a scream of sorrow, of loss, of a soul that had been left behind. The soldiers began to vanish, their forms fading into the mist as though they had never been there. The boy's figure wavered, his gaze still fixed on Thomas, a look of silent pleading etched into his ghostly face. As the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, the boy's figure dissolved into the mist, leaving Thomas standing alone in the empty field. He felt as though he had been drained of all strength, his body weak and trembling, his mind numb with the horror he had just witnessed. He stumbled back toward the inn, his steps unsteady, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The world seemed distant, muted, as though he was still trapped in that ghostly nightmare, unable to fully return to reality. When he reached the inn, Ben was waiting for him, his expression grave as he watched Thomas stagger inside. He said nothing, only poured him a cup of strong tea and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You saw him, didn't you?" Ben asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas nodded, his hands shaking as he clutched the cup. "The boy? The drummer?" Ben sighed, a look of sorrow crossing his face. "He's been there ever since the battle. Some say he's still waiting for someone to lead him home." Thomas said nothing, the weight of the encounter settling heavily on his shoulders. He knew he would never forget the boy's face, the sorrow in his eyes, the silent scream that still echoed in his mind. Thomas left Edgehill the next morning, his heart heavy and his mind haunted by the memory of the wailing drummer. He never spoke of the encounter again, but the tale of the ghostly drummer boy became a part of him, a shadow that lingered in his thoughts and dreams. The memory of the drumming would stay with him for the rest of his life, a haunting reminder of the souls that remained trapped on Edgehill, unable to find peace. And though he tried to forget, the sound of the drum would always be there, a low, steady beat that echoed in the silence, a reminder of the sorrow and pain that lay buried in that blood-soaked ground. Story 3. The Vanishing Cavalier. Even long after the Battle of Edgehill, the tales of the ghosts of that fateful night continued to circulate, casting a dark and somber shadow over the nearby villages. Children were warned to stay away from the fields, but that only fueled their curiosity. Among them was Ella Warren, a spirited young girl with a fascination for ghost stories. While she had grown up hearing the tales of Edgehill's haunted fields, she had never had the chance or the courage to see them herself. Ella was 10 years old, with a lively spirit and a curiosity that often got her into trouble. She was the youngest in her family and often left to her own devices, especially after her father's passing. To her mother's chagrin, Ella spent her time wandering the village, listening to the stories of soldiers, merchants, and travelers. The stories that fascinated her most were those about the battlefield of Edgehill and the ghosts that supposedly lingered there. She felt drawn to the tales, despite, or perhaps because of, their eerie nature. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun set in hues of gold and crimson, Ella found herself wandering toward the fields. She knew she wasn't supposed to go, but her curiosity burned. The battlefield lay quiet, shrouded in a thin mist that crept along the ground, and though fear gnawed at her insides, she pressed on. The walk to the edge of the battlefield took longer than she'd expected. By the time she arrived, the light had faded into twilight, casting long shadows across the land. The mist was thicker here, clinging to her skirts and swirling around her feet like grasping fingers. She hesitated at the field's edge, her heart beat loud in the silence. For a moment, she considered turning back, but a strange feeling held her in place, as though some invisible hand were pulling her forward. Ella took a deep breath and stepped onto the field, her heart pounding as she glanced around, half expecting to see ghostly soldiers rising from the ground. Yet all was still. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the soft rustling of the grass under her feet. As she ventured deeper into the field, a faint shape began to materialize in the mist. She stopped, holding her breath as the figure grew clearer. A rider on horseback, moving slowly across the field. Her mouth went dry as she took in the figure's appearance, her stomach twisting with both fear and awe. The man was clad in dark armor, his helmet adorned with a single ghostly plume. His face was pale and shadowed beneath the visor, his eyes fixed on some distant point, as though he was searching for something or someone. He rode with an air of sorrow, his posture slumped, his gaze downcast. Ella's heart raced, but she felt rooted to the spot, unable to look away. The man's expression held a sadness so deep it seemed to seep into the very ground around him, filling the air with an unbearable weight. She watched as he rode slowly across the field, his head turning from side to side, as if seeking a face among the shadows. The rider's gaze drifted over her without seeming to see her. Yet, when he stopped, something changed. He lifted his head, and for a brief, terrifying moment, his eyes met hers. She felt her blood turn cold, the air around her thickening with a sense of dread. His eyes were empty, hollow pits that seemed to pierce through her, seeing not the girl before him, but something, or someone, lost to him. "Have you seen them?" His voice was a low, hollow murmur, the words carrying an unnatural echo that seemed to ripple through the mist. "My brothers. Have you seen my brothers?" Ella opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She felt as though her voice had been stolen, her throat dry and her heart pounding so fiercely it seemed to echo in her ears. She could only shake her head, her wide eyes locked on the spectral figure. The cavalier's face twisted with sorrow, his gaze growing distant once more. He lowered his head, his shoulders slumping as he turned his horse, the movement slow and mournful. She felt a pang of sadness, a sympathy that mingled with her fear as she watched him continue his lonely search. The rider's figure began to fade into the mist, his outline growing faint and translucent. But just before he disappeared completely, he looked back, his hollow gaze meeting hers one last time. And in that final glance, Ella felt the weight of his despair, the sorrow of a man who had lost not only his life, but his very soul on this cursed field. Just as the rider vanished, Ella felt a strange, disorienting sensation wash over her. The world around her seemed to blur, the mist thickening until it was all she could see. And then, like the opening of a theatre curtain, the fog cleared, and she found herself standing not in the quiet field of Edgehill, but in the midst of a battlefield. The sights and sounds of war surrounded her, the clash of swords, the boom of cannon fire, and the cries of men echoing through the air. She stumbled backward, her heart racing as she took in the chaos around her. Soldiers in torn and bloodied uniforms charged past her, their faces twisted with fear and rage. Some were young, barely older than herself, while others were grizzled veterans, their expressions hardened by the horrors they had seen. She saw men fall, their bodies crumpling to the ground as the battle raged on around them, their deaths unnoticed in the frenzy of combat. Ella felt as though she were invisible, an unseen spectator caught in the midst of this nightmare. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt heavy, her body rooted to the ground as the battle unfolded around her. And then she saw him, the Cavalier. He was there, in the midst of the chaos, his dark armor gleaming with fresh blood as he fought his way through the throng of soldiers. His face was twisted with desperation, his eyes scanning the battlefield with a wild, frantic intensity. He was searching for the brothers he had lost, the comrades who had fallen around him, the men whose faces were now little more than fading memories. She watched as he fought, his sword flashing as he cut down enemy after enemy, his movements fueled by a sorrow that seemed to burn within him like a fire. But no matter how many men he cut down, no matter how many times he called out their names, his brothers did not answer. And with each passing moment, his despair grew, his once defiant expression giving way to a hollow, hopeless gaze. As the vision began to fade, Ella saw the Cavalier lower his sword, his shoulders slumping as the battle moved on without him. He was alone now, surrounded by the bodies of his fallen comrades, his head bowed in defeat. The mist closed in around him, and he looked up one last time, his hollow gaze meeting Ella's across the ages. She felt a shiver run down her spine as she saw the emptiness in his eyes, the sorrow that had consumed him and left him a ghost of the man he had once been. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the vision ended. The battlefield vanished, the sounds of war faded, and Ella found herself standing alone in the quiet field, the mist swirling around her. The silence was deafening, the weight of the vision pressing down on her like a stone. She felt tears prick at her eyes, the sorrow of the Cavalier's lost soul filling her with a grief she could not fully understand. She turned and ran, her footsteps pounding against the ground as she fled from the field. She didn't stop until she was back in the safety of her village, her heart racing and her mind reeling from the horror she had just witnessed. Ella never spoke of that night, not to her family, not to her friends, not to anyone. But the memory of the cavalier's sorrow haunted her, the weight of his despair lingering in her heart like a shadow. She knew she had seen something terrible, something that went beyond the boundaries of life and death, something that would stay with her for the rest of her days. As she grew older, Ella became known in the village as the keeper of Edgehill's stories. She told tales of the battlefield, of the soldiers who had fought and died, of the sorrow that lingered in the mist. But she never spoke of the cavalier, the lonely rider who had lost his brothers and wandered the field in search of souls long gone. Yet she could still feel his presence, his sorrow a ghostly echo that lingered in her heart. And in the quiet moments, when the world was silent and the mist hung heavy over the fields, she would think of him, the vanishing cavalier, the lost soul of Edgehill, and wonder if he still searched for his brothers, or if he had finally found the peace that had eluded him in life. Story 4. The Sobbing Shadows. In a small village not far from Edgehill, Margaret Thorne was known as a quiet, sombre woman, marked by a sorrow that others could feel when they passed her on the cobbled streets. She was a widow, her husband, Robert, having perished on the very first day of the Battle of Edgehill. Robert had been a gentle man, a farmer drawn into the conflict against his will, and he had left Margaret behind to care for their small farm alone. Every year, as the anniversary of the battle drew near, Margaret would make her pilgrimage to Edgehill. Dressed in mourning black, she would walk along the mist-shrouded road to the battlefield, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers and a letter she had written to her beloved Robert. She would sit at the edge of the field, reading her letter aloud to the wind, whispering his name into the emptiness, hoping that somehow, somewhere, he could hear her. The villagers knew of her ritual, and many whispered that she was tempting fate by returning to such a haunted place. But Margaret's grief was deeper than fear. It consumed her, filled her dreams, and left her with a loneliness that no living person could heal. Only on the field where her husband had fallen did she feel close to him, and only there did her heart find a semblance of peace. But the final year Margaret went to Edgehill would be different. She would not return to her village, and her cries of sorrow would join those of the restless spirits who wandered the field. It was a cold October evening when Margaret made her way to Edgehill for the last time. The sun was setting in hues of faded amber, casting a golden light over the landscape, and a chill wind swept across the fields, rustling the dry grasses. She clutched her small bouquet of flowers, her fingers numb from the cold, her heart heavy with the familiar sorrow that had become a part of her life. As she neared the battlefield, the mist thickened, curling around her ankles and rising like smoke from the ground. The wind seemed to carry whispers, faint voices that floated through the air, their words indistinct but filled with a terrible sadness. Margaret paused, her heart pounding as she listened, but the voices faded, leaving only the eerie silence. With a deep breath, she continued on, her feet moving with a sense of purpose that defied the chill of fear creeping up her spine. She had been here many times before, had felt the weight of the battlefield's history pressing down upon her, but tonight felt different. The air was colder, the silence heavier, as though the field itself were waiting for her, as though it knew this would be her final visit. Margaret found her usual spot, a small patch of grass at the edge of the battlefield, and knelt down, setting the bouquet of flowers on the ground in front of her. She unfolded the letter she had written to Robert, her hands shaking as she began to read, her voice a quiet whisper that carried through the stillness. "Dearest Robert," she began, her voice catching in her throat. "It has been another year without you. The farm is quiet, and the house feels so empty. I miss your laughter, your kindness, I miss you." Her voice trembled, the familiar sorrow welling up in her chest, but she forced herself to continue, the words spilling out in a rush of grief and longing. As she spoke, the mist seemed to thicken around her, curling closer, pressing in from all sides. She felt a chill seep into her bones, a coldness that was deeper than the night air, a coldness that came from the ground itself. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw them. Shadowy figures, flickering in and out of sight, drifting through the mist like wraiths. They were soldiers, their forms tattered and broken, their faces pale and haunted. Some clutched at their wounds, their expressions twisted with pain and terror, while others stood motionless, their eyes hollow, their faces blank with despair. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she realized what she was seeing. These were the spirits of the men who had fallen here, the souls of the soldiers who had been lost to the blood-soaked earth of Edgehill. She watched, frozen with fear and sorrow, as they moved through the mist, their forms fading in and out of sight, their voices a faint chorus of whispers that filled the air with a sense of endless grief. As the shadowy soldiers gathered around her, Margaret felt a strange, overwhelming urge to speak. Her voice trembled as she called out, her words barely more than a whisper. "Robert, are you here?" For a moment, the mist seemed to still, the shadows pausing in their restless movement. And then, slowly, one of the figures stepped forward, his face obscured by the shadows, his form faint and flickering in the pale light. Margaret's heart pounded as she gazed at him, her breath catching as she recognized the familiar shape of his face, the way he stood, the quiet strength that had drawn her to him all those years ago. "Robert," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The figure lifted his head, his hollow eyes meeting hers with a look of deep, unending sorrow. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out, only a faint, mournful sound that echoed through the silence like a ghostly sigh. Margaret felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she reached out to him, her hand trembling as she tried to touch his face. But her fingers passed through him, meeting only the cold emptiness of the mist. She felt a pang of despair, a sorrow so deep it seemed to cut into her soul, and she sank to her knees, her body shaking with the weight of her grief. Around her, the other shadows began to wail, their voices rising in a haunting, mournful chorus that filled the air with a sound that was both beautiful and terrible. It was a sound of sorrow, of longing, of souls that had been torn from life too soon and left to wander in an endless cycle of pain and loss. Margaret joined them, her own cries mingling with theirs, her voice a part of the chorus of sorrow that echoed across the field. She felt her spirit begin to dissolve into the mist, her body growing cold and weightless as the voices surrounded her, pulling her into their endless, mournful embrace. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the mist began to recede, pulling back into the shadows of the trees. The soldiers' wails faded, their forms dissolving into the morning light, leaving only the faintest echoes of their sorrow behind. But Margaret was gone. The villagers searched for her, combing the fields and the nearby woods, but there was no trace of the widow who had walked to Edgehill each year to mourn her lost love. Her house remained empty, her farm abandoned, her belongings untouched. Some said she had finally found peace, that her spirit had joined Robert's on the battlefield, that she had found the reunion she had longed for in life. But others, those who dared to visit Edgehill in the quiet hours before dawn, claimed to hear her voice, mingling with the wails of the other souls who wandered the field. They spoke of a new shadow among the soldiers, a woman dressed in black, her cries a haunting reminder of the grief and loss that lingered in the blood-soaked earth. Edgehill remains a place of sorrow, a battlefield haunted by the souls of those who fell in a struggle that tore families apart and left a nation scarred. The cries of the soldiers, the whispers of the fallen, and the mournful sobs of a widow who lost everything echo through the mist, a haunting reminder of the tragedy that unfolded on that cursed field. The story of Margaret, the grieving widow who joined the shadows of Edgehill, became a part of local legend, a tale passed down through generations. People spoke of her sorrow, her devotion, her love that defied death, and they warned others never to visit the battlefield after dark, for fear of becoming part of the sobbing shadows themselves. But for those who dared, those who walked the fields under the light of the moon, they might hear her voice, a faint, sorrowful cry that drifts through the mist, a reminder that some loves, some griefs, are too powerful to fade, even in death. Edgehill remains haunted by its past, a field where the horrors of war and loss replay for eternity. Those who dare to step upon its soil after dark may hear the drumming, see the spectral regiments, or catch a glimpse of the cavalier. The spirits of Edgehill remind us of a time when brother fought against brother, and lives were lost in an unforgiving struggle. The stories of this battlefield, passed down for generations, continue to chill the bones of those who listen, leaving Edgehill forever a place where the dead walk among the living.